Uh-huh.
So why should men accept or actually be bonded more strongly to their partners if they're given non-reproductive sexual opportunities?
I think if males, if one way to maintain the strength of an emotional bond with a partner is intercourse, then doing so may enhance male's commitment to his partner and in turn the offspring they have that comes down the pipe.
But is it a byproduct of kind of the way that the system, the physiology is set up that takes advantage of that? Or?
Yeah, I think male libido does have some contextual features to it. Age is the most obvious. There's no doubt. Libido, as well as other features of male anatomy and physiology, reproductive anatomy and physiology decline with age. Semen parameters, erectile dysfunction, and so forth, all age-related increases, for example, of these problems. But in terms of the social, sort of the socially contextualized male libido, novel partnerships are an important feature. But I think, to answer your question, I think males are harder to knock offline in terms of a baseline sexual desire. And in turn, it means that if they don't satisfy that sexual desire during a partner's pregnancy, they'll be more apt to stray than a female would be. And that, in turn, I think is why this, particularly late in gestation and early postpartum, becomes that period that Masters and Johnson alluded to in those ways.
I have a separate question, but just to kind of follow up on Christina's. As I understood is it a byproduct question? You're saying, okay, so there's in biparental care species, building a pair bond through coitus is clearly an adaptation. Is enhancing or reinforcing that pair bond through coitus that is non-conceptive a byproduct? And the answer is possibly, but in lots of mammals we see sexual behavior as part of bond formation, even where it's not possibly conceptive, like in same-sex sexual behavior, right? So that argues, I think, more for co-optation than for byproduct. That is, there is an affordance there that originally is about pair bonding in the context of biparental care, but that affordance constitutes a pre-adaptation that allows for secondary adaptation to develop, such as behavior during pregnancy.
Right, but that's separate from a female monopolizing all the time that the male would have available for seeking other opportunities instead.
Yeah, they can be in parallel, right? So you can imagine that enhancing the pair bond at an emotional level diminishes the desire to go elsewhere, right? And then the physiological satiation also does the same thing.
And I think we face another dilemma, which is we live in multi-male, multi-female groups. And unlike, say, gibbons, where it's might be harder to stray because you don't have you don't live in a group with 7 males and 9 females, and maybe 3 of them are cycling, of the females, let's say. You've got to leave the group in a given, to find a neighboring group to mate with, and so forth. I think the fact we live in multi-male, multi-female groups is probably ramping us up in all these measures compared to other socially bonded over long-term apes like gorillas and gibbons and siamang and so forth. But this is where, again, I'd love to see more of the comparative data on this, enter the equation to start generating testable hypotheses in the vein of byproduct, co-optation, and so forth, explicitly incorporating the comparative side to all this.
So I wanted to question you about the byproduct of the elevated testosterone and estradiol during pregnancy and the subsequent increase in female libido. So you suggested maybe Sarah Hurdy's idea about paternity confusion is wrong, and maybe even it's not necessary to invoke social bonding to explain female behavior in this context. But and that's certainly possible. But one thing we want to consider when we look at byproduct explanations is whether there are costs to the feature, because the higher the costs, one would presume, the stronger selection would be to eliminate the byproduct. Now there are constraints, so you can't always eliminate byproducts. So sex during pregnancy seems to me runs the risk of the standard risk of sexually transmitted disease that you always have, right? And then you mentioned, for example, the pH buffering effects of the ejaculate. Well, presumably that the vaginal pH is an immune defense, right? So at the same time that progesterone is shifting away from inflammation and therefore making the mother and the conceptus more vulnerable to infections, you have this problem of coitus then changing the pH in the reproductive tract, exacerbating that immunovulnerability. I mean, that would seem to suggest that there would be selection against gestational coitus. So if it's still going on, that doesn't mean it isn't a byproduct, but it's not as easily explained as a byproduct as if the costs were low.
Mm-hmm. That's it. Yeah, and I think that's I think that's a nice methodological approach to think of the costs and benefits, and if there are costs you can identify such as these, the benefits must outweigh those if there's room for a co-optation or just a straightforward adaptation hypothesis. And of course, I'm with all of you. I'm an adaptationist at heart. If everything was byproduct, it'd be boring. This generates testable hypotheses that drive a lot of the work we do, and sometimes they're supported, sometimes they're not, but it makes for a more rigorous, intellectually stimulating way about going about the world, and that applies equally well in the sexuality, pregnancy domain.
What do you think the explanation for the desire for privacy when you're having sex is seen as it's pretty rare among animals?
Well, the anthropologists who commented on this, they usually come back to the multi-male, multi-female group. That being an important factor, because if you're trying to minimize sexual jealousy, knowing that two individuals might be having sex, but someone's going to be watching, and much less, are you engaging in an extra pair copulation and so forth. But you're trying to minimize maybe sexual tensions and jealousies and so forth by doing it in private rather than in the presence of others. That probably speaks to the fact we do live in these multi-male, multi-female groups. Maybe these are fair. Well, I don't know.
It's not
I'll
a
stop.
comparative argument, though, because other
Yeah.
multi-male, multi-female groups, it's more like an assertion of dominance. You do it intentionally in front of other individuals because you're not only doing it for reproductive advantage, but you're also advertising.
What would you guess?
I don't know. That's why. I mean, certainly people must have written about this, haven't they?
So I think there's I think what I threw out would be the main hypothesis. So, other thoughts on this? Yeah.
Oh, sorry, Dan.
I was just going to suggest in that context that you don't want to rule out cultural rules, right? So people who are severely developmentally delayed or brain damaged, they basically have no sexual modesty, right? So I'm sure Alan can tell us about your frontotemporal dementia patients who basically are avid, practitioners of sex in public when they experience severe dementia sometimes, right? And that points more toward, now granted adaptations can be damaged by brain lesions and all the rest of it, but it strikes me that this is a cultural adaptation. So you won't see it in other primates that live in multi-male, multi-female groups because it's a way of getting people this is a source of conflict among individuals, is sexual jealousy. So if you're going to have stable marriages and not have people at each other's throats all the time.
Well, the other variable to throw in there would be you're forming long-term bonds within those multi-male, multi-female groups. I left that part out. So Hamadryas baboons, then, do they care if they're observed in their long-term mateships with others? I don't think they do still. So I think Dan also qualified adaptation, cultural adaptation is how the anthropologists who commented on it too would have interpreted that.
I would think language too would be really important because you have the ability to express dominance or the fact that sexual relationship is occurring without actually having to show it, right? And so you may be able to protect, I don't know, as a complement to sort of being able to keep the actual act private, you could sort of manipulate it in all sorts of different ways with language, whether you wanted to say it was happening when it wasn't or say it was happening when it was.
I think there's another couple more ideas to throw in the flames. Yeah.
I heard, maybe it was from another talk in this group, that there actually is a pattern of non-private sex that's specific to intergroup conflict, where the warrior band goes in and rapes everybody in sight as a group.
Yeah.
And we have football teams instead. But apparently somebody's discovered a different pattern that's specific to.
Yeah, I think among the Mehu Naku of Lower Amazonia, for example, they've talked about gang rapes by males in the men's houses. If you go into one of these houses, in the rare event, you might be gang raped. They have drawn parallels. I think Gregor even drew a parallel to what you alluded to in the U.S. With fraternity rapes and so forth. So, but it is very, that's a totally different, or it is a very different context though from the day-to-day long-term bonds.
What I'm saying is that pattern
Yeah.
must suggest something about
Yeah.
the function and origin of the underlying pattern.
Yeah.
were mentioning how children learn about this, so on, and at least in East Africa and horticultural societies, in other parts of Africa, it's not in the household with your parents, it's with peers. So it is more semi-public. You have institutionalized cousins or uncles, older relatives as part of the pre-initiation period that bring youth into households at night where they practice sex but without intercourse, so that pregnancy is unlikely. And so the way most of kids learn this is through peers and older, younger peers. It's not, it's mixed age that's more important as mixed sex groups. So you have the opportunity to acquire the knowledge in that way. And I'm speaking about maybe a generation ago when this was still widely practiced.
Yeah. And Lynn, I wanted to ask you, could you pull in again some maybe non-human context on that too? In terms of the juvenile work you've done, how often are the young watching parents versus maybe peers, let's say, with whom they're engaging in sex?
Young are watching, and if anything, an interesting thing is harassment of your mother having sex with the male while she's doing it as sort of a sibling competition. I've seen that in my colony, and it's been reported in other species too. I think it's really interesting. I mean, we have this notion that young are harmed by seeing sex. You know, from Freud, I guess. But really, in all other species, it's just normal, and it's almost strange that we have this notion that this should be a harmful thing to witness.
And because it's so strange, then we have to explain it. And here's the best we've done this far.
So there's this apprenticeship, or an idea much more probably the model than this idea that it's harmful. I was going to ask you about Kuvad beliefs. You talked about this with the male parallel activities, but the Kuvad is an institutionalized system in many parts of the world which draws men into parallel experiences and household activities to women. And wouldn't that reduce, and along with it, it reduces sexual desire, supposed to.
It's supposed to, yeah. And it was hard to actually find, well, the way the word kuvad has been used by anthropologists versus, more recently, biomedical scientists versus psychologists, they're often speaking about slightly different things. So it's hard to have a unified term and concept across disciplines when the word kuvad is used. That said, it certainly has a big anthropological literature on that. We do touch on that in one of the chapters in the book. And I think the simple way to help make sense of its application in some places and not others is you are trying to bring men in and confer paternity on them and pull them into long-term investment, including in places where maybe otherwise they might be more, I don't know, but by saying you need to change your diet, you need to change your activities, because you are going to be involved in this subsequent offspring's care. It's almost like pulling this guy and making him commit to that care. So I think that's one way to make sense of it. But then looking at the anthropological scholarship, I actually found a hard time finding studies where they would report on where it was present, but also the symptoms men experience. Like, how often did you find diminished libido? How often did you find guys saying, "I feel nauseous"? Like, because people have drawn parallels in non-human animal models, such as dwarf hamsters. Do humans, males, have this kuvad syndrome where they feel nauseous because their pregnancy hormones are rising in tune with those of their partners? And it's harder to see a direct parallel when you start getting into those domains. But it is an interesting area, and at least there's a couple cents on it.
So, so kind of relating to some of Dan's earlier commentary. So you mentioned how coital frequency within pair bonds changes throughout a pregnancy in the talk, but I'm not sure if I missed it, but I don't think you commented on how coital frequency might change as a function of the months before conception and after conception, right? So,
Right.
So if ejaculates do have some sort of immunosuppressant properties, that's another reason why you might expect coital frequency to drop right after conception, right? Because of the
That's
vulnerability of the embryo. So,
Yeah.
do you know any data on that, or
The tricky thing is that to get these long-term prospective studies, you have to start with women who are cycling and who want to have kids, or men who, you know, ideally we have men and women together in a study who want to have kids and then follow them. More often than not, these studies have begun with women who were already at a stage where they were pregnant, let's say, and then followed them. So it's partly just a methodological constraint, I think, for why we don't have more of those types of data to begin with. And as someone thinking of doing my work like this myself, I'm probably going to start with women who are already pregnant because of the same constraint. But I think it's that all said. I think, you know, this is yet another area to entertain adaptationist hypotheses from the start, and think of how to test them if you can get the data.
Now, what about the fashion of involving fathers in childbirth classes that we have?
Yeah. What about, the question was, what about the dads in childbirth classes? So you could draw some parallels maybe to the Kuvad in that way, where you're asking men to commit and think of holding things. And I myself went to one of these classes. It was I'd held a real baby for 10 minutes before I held a plastic baby that I thought was so ridiculous. I was playing with it and all these other things because I knew it's a plastic doll. What are you trying to trick me into thinking parental psychology on display here? No. But in terms of dads are definitely getting more involved. We have time allocation data in the US that go from the 60s to the present, which show the number of minutes dads are doing things like changing diapers and spending direct time with kids, and that's increasing. Why is that? I think that's going hand in hand with the rise in males getting involved in these child rearing classes. If you live in households where you don't have your extended kin nearby, fewer and fewer of us do. We're also having fewer and fewer kids because it's so hard to raise them, it's so expensive to raise them, among other factors. The consequence is you're relying more and more on dads to do stuff in a way you might have sort of mixed it up more with grandma, aunt, dad, and others. And that's just talking about the US within the last couple of generations. But cross-culturally, just to pull out one interesting tidbit, I didn't find a single society where dads regularly were involved in birth, delivery of babies, like bedside or headside or anything like that in a cross-cultural sample. So this is something I think now that from the time I was delivered in the early 70s, in the US we've seen relatively few dads were bedside. Nowadays, dads are the majority. The majority of births in the US, dads are present bedside. This has changed dramatically fast in the US, but it's also weird in the cross-cultural context where you don't tend to see that. But why are we pulling dads in more? I think because of these factors. Well, if your mom's not around, your aunt's not around, you got strangers, maybe doulas, get the guy involved because at least he's better than a stranger.
But would you find greater commitment after birth then?
A few have looked at that. I don't know this. I can't give you a specific study on that. Some people have looked at that, and some have said things, but I couldn't give you a specific study on that.
Have there been made efforts to determine how much romantic attachment changes during pregnancy and after birth, as opposed to sex?
Yeah. They're definitely intertwined insofar as the only data point I threw up that said that explicitly, but I think this is probably illustrative. The relationship dynamics do predict when you return to postpartum sex and how often. So relationship quality and is definitely intertwined with that. But this is hard to quantify. For those of you that cross-cultural researchers have thought, how do I quantify the basis of emotional bonds in marriage in this society versus that, versus that, versus that? Those of you who contemplated this stuff know how hard it is to try to come up with a measure that would work across all those to maybe allow such studies. So usually you're just restricted to somewhere a questionnaire measure with 7 items on the Likert scale, let's say, as a consequence.
I just wondered if we could come back to this theme, I guess it's present in some birds, it's pretty rare in mammals, where you have a lot of paternal investment, but you also have these multi-male groups that are living in very close proximity, and males and their partners' fitness depends a lot on this male-male cooperation. So you've got this funny trade-off, and you think if you're going to invest a lot as a male, you just go off and live by yourself, so that you can be sure of paternity. But on the other hand, you have these tremendous benefits in humans of both informational exchange and also cooperation in large-scale activities and sharing of the hunt and so forth and so on. In terms of the physiology of sex and reproduction, I mean, are there any things that would be predicted from this pattern is relatively unusual in at least mammals? Is what are the adaptations to this funny combination of I'm investing a lot, but yet the males are around my partner all the time?
Well, yeah, Brooke commenting on, you got communication too, in terms of keeping track of relationships. In terms of the physiology, there's a huge literature on testosterone and male relationships in the avian literature, as well as now humans. We've reviewed some of that, or we've reviewed that stuff in this edited book that came out last year that Lynn contributed to as well.
Very nice book too.
Well, thank you. So that did get into that, and I think that fits with this social context to male testosterone, insofar as males involved in long-term family relationships, such as marriage or fatherhood, tending to have lower testosterone than other men in those same samples. I think that speaks to kind of adaptive male reproductive physiology.
But that might be true if the males were, formed a pair bond and then go and then live in isolation. But what's funny about humans is this big paternal investment, while there's huge risk that you won't be able to control your paternity because you're not keeping your mate far away from other males.
Yeah, and then you get into male, what you're saying, male relationships, and if you can't mess with that guy because of his allies, and people will talk, gossip, and networks, and all this stuff, that might be enough to defray you from doing that, which in turn ties into this issue of human egalitarianism. What are the mechanisms by which we reinforce these egalitarian tendencies, which do stand out, I think, compared to say, chimps? How do we do that? Gossip is certainly part of this. Maybe, again, having sex in private is part of this, trying to maintain egalitarian relationships, rather than being a dominant male that will have sex in the presence of others and show all the other males off. Instead, we're going to take that away, because other males may not like it either, to see that on display as a dominance mechanism. But I'm not sure what else to say. There's one other thing I could say. I don't know if this is legitimate, but Alan Dixon in that same book did look at baseline male testosterone across different primate species in relation to mating systems, and he put us in like the unimale group, I think it was. But again, you're looking across species. I'm not sure if that's okay. But his point was you'd actually have differences in baseline male testosterone across species based on some of these social factors you raised up.
You mentioned male strain during this period of less sexual activity during pregnancy, but that's clear evidence that you've got reproductive success in the works.
Yeah.
What about couples that don't have successful reproduction? Like in the old comparative literature is that gull pairs, pair-bonded birds will break up if they have a season, more likely to break up after a season of reproductive failure. Are there any, but in our culture we do seem to have successful couples that intentionally don't reproduce. But, are there data on the balance between sex, success, and continued pair bonding?
I think only insofar as, again, like relationship quality is tied into this, which tells you that there's something there. But do we have data on relationship dissolution in relation to coital patterns during pregnancy and postpartum? Not to my knowledge. And again, there's some really basic things calling out, like stepfathers who are entering relationships caring for a child that's not their own. Maybe you'd expect them to have elevated sexual function compared to a genetic father, if you could hold all else being equal, because of the need to involve that male when there's a cost to him of doing so. So to answer your question, I didn't have any other data besides that, but I think we could think of plenty of other interesting variables to explore in future data sets.
Any more questions?
And I have to say, I realize I got some grad students, some undergrads, some faculty. I find that the relevance of this probably increases significantly if you have kids. If I was an undergrad and had to listen to such a time, it's so far removed from my radar screen, I would hardly know what to think about this now.
You don't want to think about your own
That's definitely, and that's important. But then again, well, pick up, listen, are you jumping in though? Mom and Dad, don't, please. But if you have kids of your own someday, maybe this will prompt some other sparks to think about. So thanks.